Om. 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 Om Namo Bhagavate Buddhaya. Om Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. So here we just started our study of this book, Buddhist Thought in India by Edward Conze, and we went through the preface in which the author, Edward Conze, emphasized that our focus should be more on demonstrable insight than on ostensible erudition. That is, scholarly showing. It's just showing just the show as a scholar. The show of scholarship is inferior to demonstrable insight. So we must make our study whereby we are able to gain insight into this knowledge and not just parrot some of these words. That was one. And the second thing important is, as contrary to the ways of the whole world, has this dharma been demonstrated. So this dharma demonstrated, the teaching, dharma means teaching here. The teaching is demonstrated in contrary to the ways of the world that we know now. So that is how it is. And it teaches you not to seize upon the dharmas, but the world is want to grasp at anything. The world is want to grasp at anything. The world is habituated to in a customary way, not really with a deeper analysis. Just by habit it is grasping at things, means identifies. I belong to it, or that belongs to me. That kind of a relationship whereby you identify as a person and you contextualize your personality with the environment and you are. That's how I do, that's how you do, everybody does. So this is not the true reflection of reality. So that's why Buddha's teaching says, you disengage or disidentify or do not seize upon the dharmas. So this is the core of the message. And after that he also emphasized that the philosophy should have on its core, as it happened or happens in the Eastern religion, the yogic trance, samadhi, provides the wisdom, and the philosophy is built on that knowledge gained through yoga and not a speculative method, and not an empirical method of observation and theorizing as it happens in the so-called scientific world or the European and the Western thinking. So these are the primarily differences as he observed. And then here we have this book in three different parts: Archaic Buddhism, the Sthaviras, and the third part, the Mahayana. I think in my earlier presentation I said 4 parts by mistake. It's only 3 parts. And the first part was the Archaic Buddhism, which means the original Buddhism, having the content based on distilling the teachings of the Buddha, as we know. The Vachana, Buddha Vachana, the spoken word of the Buddha, as it is available to us today. If we distill through that, what are the principles? That is what is recorded in the Archaic Buddhism or original Buddhism. Then the second part is the Sthaviras. So as we know from the literature available, after passing away of the Buddha, there was a lot of schism and many schools formed out of Buddha's teaching. As many, maybe 60 at some time, or at least 18 are fairly well known in terms of what they really professed. So out of them there is something called Sthaviras, which really formed a very strong religious and literary structure, I would say, literary structure. So if we analyze based on the Sthavira's teaching, that is in the second part, which actually gave to principal text as we know today. So we'll come to that. And the third part is the Mahayana. So Mahayana is the teaching which came out of primarily a philosophical thinking called Prajna Paramita, perfection of wisdom, perfection of wisdom. The perfection of wisdom is a distillation of the same Buddha Vachana, but highlighting a different dimension of understanding than what the previous generation of Buddhists practiced. So the previous one, which I said Archaic Buddhism, it was popularly branded as Hinayana. Hinayana means lower vehicle. After the Mahayana came about, that became Hinayana. So the Mahayana means greater vehicle. So this Mahayana Buddhism has its beginnings in the Prajna Paramita or perfection of wisdom literature, which later got formulated into the Sunyavada or Madhyamika philosophy of Nagarjuna. And of course there is also Yogachara, which is also a further explanation or expansion of the Madhyamika philosophy from Sunyavada to Vijnanavada. So this is the coverage of this book, which is basically introductory, meaning that it surveys various technical terminology in these lines and puts them here together in terms of preliminaries and the sustenance, and finally what is the deliverance or where you reach in the Buddhist terminology, what is called as nirvana. So those are the three different phases which are really well documented here based on the available scriptures and literature. And there is also an article, a small article on the Tantra. It's really nothing more than mentioning that this book does not cover Tantra. There is a text literature called as, for example, there are various tantras which are basically meditational practices other than what was advocated in the Hinayana or the Archaic Buddhism and the analytical meditations of the Mahayana. Apart from those two, you have the visualizations and meditations as called as tantras, which are not covered in this introductory book. Popularly, for example, there's a textbook called Guhya Samaja Tantra, means secret group practices they call it. Basically, they're meditations. So Madhyamikas also follow that. And later we know the Vajrayana Buddhism, which is basically Tantra, Tantric method, Tantric Buddhism as they call it, more popular through the Tibbeti Buddhism. But that is not part of this book. So here, to begin with, we can first see what are the topics covered in the first part, which we aim to cover, which spans about 116 pages in this book, pretty dense. So in this first part, which is Archaic Buddhism, we have tacit assumptions as chapter 1. Tacit means what are the fundamental assumptions which have formed the basis of Buddhism, or for that matter the philosophical outlook of people in the Indian subcontinent, whether it be Buddhism or Hinduism or Jainism. They all have certain spiritual orientation because of their long history of cultural evolution, spiritual evolution. So before the Buddhist thought came into picture, that was already given. So that environment. So what are their assumptions which became the fertile ground on which Buddhist thought developed is mentioned in the tacit assumptions. Then the second chapter is the problem of original Buddhism. Because sitting here in 2023, how do I know what Buddhism was all about 2,500 years ago? About 500 to 600 years prior to the Christian era. What it was, we don't know. We have to depend on the literature available today, and the initial literature was not obviously recorded in papers as we have today. It was only orally transmitted. So there is certainly some doubt in the comprehensiveness of what we could inherit from those oral teachings. So that is why what is the difficulty or the problem of original Buddhism. And the third is the 3 marks and the perverted views. So what are the 3 marks of this life experience? As we know, what are the 3 marks? So we know that anything, for example, you see anything that changes. You put a seed into the soil, it becomes a plant, sprout, and the plant, tree, and one day it will wither, fall away. So like this. So basically, Buddhism identifies certain marks of our human experience. And then what are the perverted views? Perverted views is if you do not align yourself with those marks and cultivate some other views, they are perverted views because you are taken away from reality. So what are those? It analyzes here, a couple of words here mentioned. Impermanence. Then it has not self, means anatta. Anatta means there is no self of any personality. So I, as a Swami, have a personality. I think I am a person. You think you are a person. But the Buddhist teaching says, really there is no core entity behind this personality, what they call as not self or non-self, anatta. Then it talks about the 4 perverted views, which we will see later. Then the 5 cardinal virtues. So in the path of Buddhist cultivation, Buddhist knowledge, what are the virtues that are needed? Virtues are something, in fact, that can be cultivated. So what are those 5 cardinal virtues that need to be cultivated to gain experience of this Buddhist teaching? Now, he lists here a couple of them here in the main contents. Faith is one. Faith, mindfulness, and transic concentration. Trance means samadhi. So a concentration which is termed as trance. So concentration can be anything, any levels. But the depth of concentration needed to experience this Buddhist goal is what is called trance or a samadhi. Mindfulness is being aware of things, being awareful. Then wisdom is a knowledge or a gnosis. What is the final knowledge that comes? What is that reality, knowledge of the reality? Of course, there are preliminary knowledge that you need to cultivate. Chapter number 5, the final stages of deliverance. So, in the final stages of approaching nirvana, what is it that you can have as identifications, and what it would be like to experience nirvana means. A few topics here. The breakthrough to the unconditioned. Breakthrough to the unconditioned. The unconditioned is the stage of nirvana. Right now what we experience is a conditioned state. Means conditioned by our circumstances, our limitations, our environment, our context. Of course, the context includes our mind, because mind is the main context in which our experiences are filtered through. So, if you are able to uncondition yourself, where we reach is the nirvana. So, a great amount of explanation on that. Then the 3 doors to deliverance. What are the 3 doors through which you need to pass or identify? Maybe they are connected well to come to nirvana. What are the 3 doors to deliverance? They are listed here as the emptiness. One needs to know emptiness, sunya. You can also say this to be neither perception nor non-perception. I think we'll come to that at a very later stage. But for now, emptiness is not having any core. Not having any core. Any phenomena that you observe, any dharma has no core. That's what it means, emptiness. There is nothing in the core of any of the phenomena that you see. Okay? and it is just contextual. Second thing is the signless. Signless means not having a person in the personality. Not really having a person in the personality. I think I am a Swami, but is there anything at the core of it called a person truly that really transmigrates from birth to death to birth? That is what he's talking about, signless. He says there is really no sign in our assumption of a personality. Then the wishless. The wishless. When the person is wishless, then is their entry into the nirvana. That's what it means. Wishless or desireless. So because desirelessness brings in a state of mind, such state of mind is required for experiencing or coming in contact with the nirvana. That's what it means. Then he finally talks about what nirvana is. How do I know? How do I describe? Because as we know, we in the both Upanishadic terminology and Buddhist terminology, there is no way to describe this nirvana. But you can experience nirvana. So this is why nirvana is difficult to be taught except by a lot of additional ancillary help. So here the author very expertly picked different words and phrases and symbols that are used throughout the Buddhist scriptures to indicate this nirvana, so that we in our common level understanding can clearly say what we are aiming to reach, So that is a topic on that. Then you have chapter number 6, which is cultivation of social emotions. Because it is important that we gain the benefit of nirvana, but it is also a fact that we need to live here. While living here, we have to reach nirvana. So what is the way to conduct our social interactions? What should be the parameters so that our social interactions are smooth, easy, and we do not get into conflict with our goals to nirvana? So for that, there are 4 principles: friendliness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and impartiality. These are the 4. These are called Brahma Viharas, or Brahma Viharas, as they pronounce. Brahma Viharas are divine qualities. Brahma Viharas are divine qualities that you need to possess so that your socially generated emotions are balanced and do not play a conflict with the mindset required for nirvana. Then there are 2 chapters which are more on the categories of this system: dharma and dharmas. Dharma means, in a way, teaching. Dharma means teaching. Buddhist teaching is called dharma. Second is, dharma also means what is that final ontological being, which is also called dharma. For example, in the Hindu terminology we use Brahman. The Brahman is nothing but dharma, or the being, the one being. So that dharma. And dharmas. Dharmas are, as we already heard a few times, are the things, are the events, are our experiences, are happenings that comprise our experience. For example, when we say a particular object, a table is there, a table is made of wood, maybe it has got a glass top, maybe it has got some joints, nuts and bolts, and so on. So these are the parts. Similarly, if you look at the Sankhya philosophy, where we say Prakriti and Purusha, there are 2 categories. They have distinct characteristics. Now there are 2 parts. Now if you take Prakriti, again they call it as Sattva, Rajas and Tamas. So Prakriti is made of Sattva, Rajas and Tamas. So though the word guna means quality or a color or a characteristic, here it does not mean that. When you say Prakriti is made of 3 gunas, it means 3 components, 3 parts. There is something called Sattva, something called Rajas, something called Tamas. Those are the names they chose. So as we say part number A, part B, part C, like that. So here, dharma means the parts of our experience. For example, when I see an object, a cow, that is a dharma. When I hear a sound, a lion's roar, it is a dharma. So everything that forms our experience is a dharma. So now identifying the dharmas that have to be identified clearly, indubitably, without a doubt, clearly, so that we can know reality, really what is here. To know these dharma and dharmas are detailed, and then, as I said, dharma here we are referring to human experience. So here we primarily not really concerned with what is outside, but what is our human experience. That is what it is. So the elements that comprise our human experience are dharmas. Then the last chapter on skandhas, sense fields, and elements. So these are, as I said, these are the fundamental constituents of our human experience. Maybe like a hill, maybe like a river. These are the physical elements, or form elements. So there's many form elements like that. Similarly, sound. So you think there are millions of such experiences and billions of components. They are grouped for our understanding of analysis into 5 skandhas, 5 heaps or groups or categories. So this chapter deals with various classifications that are employed in the analysis in the Buddhist thought, so that comprehensively we know what is our human experience and how we are experiencing it today based on perverted views. And as you clear up the views, that is, purify yourself, then you would come to knowing the correct knowledge about the reality. So this talks about the first part on the archaic or original Buddhism. So this text is primarily based on several of the available literature, and a lot is dependent on, he quite refers very many times to this book, The Path of Purification, by Buddha Ghosha, who lived in the 5th century AD. He developed this great book, a compendium of different classifications of the eightfold path, of Buddha's eightfold path, Ashtanga of the Buddha. And in that there are, as we saw earlier, there are certain virtues to be developed. So how to develop, what are those virtues, how to develop them, what are the mental factors involved, and ultimately what is the nature of nirvana, and all that is exhaustively discussed in this Visuddha Magga by Buddha Ghosha of the 5th century. So many of the references belong to that. And the second one is Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha, which is another textbook which also deals with these categories exhaustively. So based on those and many other scriptures, this first part is developed. So you saw one. Similarly, there is another textbook, for example, for those of you who want familiarity with these words, The Path of Freedom. The Path of Freedom. Vimukti Magga. Vimukti Magga means path of freedom. So, okay. So, beautiful books that deal with the Buddhist discourse on what to cultivate and how to cultivate and what it means to be free and attaining nirvana. And the author, Edward Conze himself, was a great meditator and developed his Buddhistic inclinations based on that. And he devoted a lot of time for studying what is called as Prajna Paramita Sutra, based on which the Madhyamika philosophy developed. Madhyamika of Nagarjuna, Sunyavada of Nagarjuna, Madhyamika philosophy as it is called. And that itself depended on a precursor philosophical literature known as perfection of wisdom, or Prajna Paramita Sutra. Prajna Paramita Sutra, which developed probably between 150 BC to 100 AD. 150 BC to 100 AD. During this time, Prajna Paramita Sutra. So Edward Conze translated one of those into 8 Prajna Paramita. It says the perfection of wisdom in light of in 8,000 lines. 8,000 lines, and its verse summary and in the Prakrita language. From that he translated into English. Great textbooks. I originally wanted to read this book for the benefit of people so that you can gain something, but I then thought, I was inclined to going back one step down to giving a little elementary reading from Edward Conze and then going there so people may benefit. As I would like to be clear that this is not of any gainful employment for me. I am quite thankful to the teachings of the great Buddha, and of course the teachers who came in the tradition and preserved it and it is available to us, and I myself read many of the contemporary books and learn, and Edward Conze was one who came into my research investigation, and then he inspired certainly, and I want people to benefit out of this information, and those of you who can afford and who have access to may buy and study those books. I just want to be helping, and I would think greatly privileged to be able to read this and be a small way, contributing to the spread of the Dharma. That is about it. And then, in this perfection of wisdom literature, there are many books. What I showed you is a perfection of wisdom or Prajna Paramita in 8,000 lines. Similarly, there is something in 25,000 lines or 100,000 lines. So such books were also studied by Edward Conze and translated into English. One of such is this large wisdom sutras. The large sutra on perfection of wisdom with the divisions of the Abhisamaya Alankara. So I'm not going into that right now, but basically, obviously a man who has studied so well the Madhyamika philosophy, and he also translated the other smaller books of the Prajna Paramita, like the Perfection of Wisdom texts, short Prajna Paramita texts. So for example, in this it talks about in 25 lines and 50 lines, 700 lines, 500 lines, then it takes 150 lines. So basically he has taken the shorter Prajna Paramita text and they convey this message. And there is also a great book on Buddhist wisdom, which primarily he translated what is called as the Diamond Sutra. Diamond Sutra, which is Sanskrit, it's called as Vajrachedika Prajna Paramita Sutra. Vajrachedika Prajna Paramita Sutra. People also call it the Diamond Cutter. Obviously, they're a very, very sharp and very incisive, very powerful way of communicating how we have destroyed our knowledge of reality by our conditioning and how you should approach unconditioning yourself. Similarly, there is another great text which is Heart Sutra, it is called. Heart Sutra. Hridaya Sutra in Sanskrit. Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra. So these are the two texts he translated. So there is an enormous amount of work he did in coming up to Madhyamika philosophy, and in which Prajna Paramita being the basis of even the Madhyamika, he spent a lot of time. The reason I thought I should introduce to at least even some of the books that there are many other books, a few other books of Edward Conze and others that I see. Unless somebody is really willing to take out time and read these textbooks and cultivate contemplation based on them, I do not see a way to find ease in our living. So please contemplate, reflect on this, and we will continue with the text in our next recordings. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.